Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Diana Conway. I am president of the Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club, and I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. We have a great program for you featuring the unique perspective of Dr. Fiona Hill on Putin and his war in Ukraine. Before we begin, and on behalf of our whole board, I really want to thank you all of our members for joining us and for supporting the club, and to welcome all of our friends. I'm told we have a nice uptick in new people who are first-time registrants. So thank you, Dr. Hill, for bringing these folks in. And I encourage any of you who are first-timers to one of our programs to drop into the chat what it is that got you here. As my membership chair, Enid Light, texted me, she said, "Come for Fiona, stay for WDC." So please consider joining WDC for a membership of $35. We need your dues to cover minimal operating costs, room rentals, credit card fees, and to help keep our in-person events affordable. Scott, can we have our first slide, please? Thank you. So this is a club, and we're a club of all kinds of people, men, women, activists, followers, leaders. We've been around for over 60 years, and we put on a variety of programs in person and more now, of course, remotely. We'll be returning to our happy hours with a purpose. We'll be doing more community panels and more speakers like this. We just hosted Chuck Rosenberg last week, which was great fun at the universities at Shady Grove. Next slide, please. We have a very active committee structure with a lot of work going on. And again, this is a all volunteer working board. So we'd love to have you participate in any of these aspects. We specifically need some support for our historian chair, Teddy Pensinger. The finance chair, Mary Lou Fox, is looking for a support. And also membership, Enid Light is looking for a co-chair, as our communications folks are looking for help on database management. So we would love to have any of you reach out to us to offer to help us out on that. Next slide, please. This is our executive committee. Thank you, everybody. And a list of recent speakers. At the bottom, you'll also see the sort of the premier events that we follow, that we engage in. So issue advocacy, Annapolis Day, I'll say more about that in a word, and our happy hours and candidate forums. You may remember from last cycle, we did the state's attorney, the county executive, and oh my gosh, state's attorney, county executive. I'm forgetting the third one, I apologize. Carry on, next slide. Okay, Annapolis Day. You may know we have a 90-day session in Annapolis during which the state's entire business and budget has to be decided. All the bills have to be written, amended, and voted on. WDC is hosting a virtual Annapolis Day again, February 18th. So coming up soon, and it is a terrific opportunity for you to hear from our leads on the issues that WDC cares most about, and to engage with the legislators that represent us. We have the biggest legislation in the state, and these folks make themselves very available to us. It's a great way to participate and learn from your co-activists, and also get to talk to the legislators making these decisions. These are bills that are actually going to change reality on the ground for our fellow Marylanders: criminal justice reform, aging population, healthcare, reproductive health, education and the blueprint, family law, gun safety, lots and lots of issues. And at the state level, an organization like WDC can really move the needle if we have people like you backing us. So please sign up and join. And I think the contact information is certainly on our website, but I think it's going to show up in the chat shortly too. So let's see. Yes, thank you. Next event is on February 21st, a conversation with Jason Green, who is a 5th-generation resident of the Quince Orchard area and a documentary filmmaker. So please save that date. I think we do not have any elected officials to recognize, but the other upcoming events are, we have an annual Tommy Raskin speaker event based on the mission of the Tommy Raskin Memorial Foundation for People and Animals. That is put together in collaboration with the family. And then we always have members of our federal delegation. We'll have a Women's History Month speaker, an Earth Day speaker, and then, of course, every 2 years we have our meeting and elections for the executive committee. So that will be sometime later this summer. And we know that you are very well plugged in out there, so we'd love to have your connections and your ideas for speakers to reach out to try to make programs like this. As a final reminder, I think we are asking you to remember that we want your input, but you're muted. So please put your questions into Q&A. You're welcome to put anything you'd like into the chat, but to get them to the right place to be asked, please make sure you address the question to Q&A. And I think that's it. Is that it for slides? Yes. Okay, on to our program. Thank you. I am thrilled and honored to welcome back Dr. Fiona Hill, a woman with a lot of material and links and footnotes on her wiki page. Dr. Hill was born in Northeast England, daughter of a coal miner and a midwife. She studied history and Russian at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, followed by a master's degree and a PhD at Harvard, with her thesis, of course, on Russia. She was a researcher at the Kennedy School at Harvard, an intelligence analyst under Bush II and Obama. She was at the National Intelligence Council, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a board of trustees of the Eurasia Foundation. She was appointed for a while at the Trump administration as deputy assistant to the president and senior director for Europe and Russian affairs to the National Security Council staff, and had been due to leave the White House to go back to Brookings in April 2019, but was asked to stay on a little bit longer by her national security advisor. She left the White House ultimately on July 15th, as it turns out, 10 days before the perfect phone call. So you probably remember Dr. Hill first hit most of our radars as a riveting witness in the fall of 2019 for the Ukraine hearings. And from there, you were sort of catapulted onto the world stage of commentary with an extra credit for the most entertaining accent anybody in the States has gotten to hear for a while. So I also want to comment, you've got a fabulous book that came out just about a year ago. There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. So with that long lead in, please take the stage and welcome back to WDC. We look forward to hearing your remarks and getting some questions.
Oh, well, thanks so much. It's really great to be here. And, you know, I'll just take a lead from where you stopped everything there, Diane, because I would really like to have this as more of a, it's a Friday, it's kind of in the afternoon. Hopefully people have had their lunch or are thinking about lunch. And, as we go into the weekend, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there are an awful lot of questions on people's minds about, like, where are we at the moment with Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine, and where do we go from here? And I know it's on my mind. I'm talking about it constantly. I mentioned when I came on that I'd actually just done this morning a strategy session with the Dutch Foreign Ministry by Zoom. Obviously, I'm in Bethesda rather than in Leiden or The Hague or somewhere. And they're all in the same state the rest of us are in, just trying to figure out about what is the end game here and where do we go from here. But some of the way that the discussion was phrased actually made me reflect backwards. And, you've just opened it up by mentioning when I kind of got catapulted onto the global stage, I mean, really in ways that I would never have anticipated. And I think, very sadly, there is a direct line from all of those episodes that led into the first impeachment trial through to this conflict, to this war in Ukraine. Because Russia presumed, and Vladimir Putin presumed, that Ukraine was kind of meaningless. And it was just really a kind of a tool for domestic politics. And I look back and I think about the times when we would meet with Russian counterparts like Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the National Security Council in Russia, and they would say to us, "What does Ukraine mean to you?" And I don't think we ever gave them a very convincing answer, because they were sort of assuming that the United States looked at Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence, and that we were engaged in some respects in some kind of battle with Russia over where Ukraine's going to fall in east or west of Europe. And it's worth bearing in mind that somebody like Vladimir Putin and the people around him tend to think in old Soviet and maybe even Russian imperial terms about the world, and certainly Europe, being carved up into a sphere of influences. And of course, that's not how we're thinking, but here we are in February of 2023. In February of 1945 was the Yalta meetings, for the end of the war, in which, in fact, Winston Churchill does hand over at some point after those meetings with Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin and in Yalta, a kind of a piece of paper blueprint suggesting that there are spheres of influence, and that, as the Allies occupy Germany, a divided Germany, that being the United States, France, and Britain, that they're going to recognize parts of Eastern Europe and, of course, the territories of the Soviet Union as lying within the Soviet Union's purview. And Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union. We recognize Russia as a successor state to the Soviet Union in 1991. And then we fail to recognize that Russia and Putin and people like that around him continue to think in these terms. Because when we look back to the early 1990s, and there's been some very interesting material just being released, declassified by the State Department, from all of the memorandum of the first Bush administration, Herbert Walker Bush, in exchanges with Boris Yeltsin after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and when Russia is now an independent state and has been recognized as a successor state to the Soviet Union, of Yeltsin assuring Bush, and these are all online, so you can go and take a look at them, that he is not somebody who was given to imperialist thinking, that he's got a great relationship with the then president of Ukraine, Kravchuk. He understands, the tensions there. And Russia does not have any designs on Ukrainian territory. And then there's one of the cables also has some interviews with Yegor Gaidar, who was the deputy prime minister at the time, someone who some of you may remember, one of the reformists in Russia, basically telling another interlocutor from the US embassy, there's no way, that tensions between Ukraine and Russia, which are definitely there and are getting worked out, will end up in a Yugoslav-type conflict. This is the early 1990s. Of course, 30 years on, that's where we are. Because the people like Yeltsin and Gaidar, they left the scene. And they're replaced by the people around Putin, how Putin himself rises to the top, who are still stuck in the whole way of thinking that, well, if Russia's a successor state to the Soviet Union, then we lost all of this territory. It's a kind of a revanchist view. We need to get it back again. And we failed to recognize all the way along there that that was actually what this was all about. And so when President Trump is sort of sitting there interacting with Putin, and Putin's telling him that Ukraine's part of Russia, and people speak Russian, so they're therefore they're part of Russia. Nobody's really kind of alerting to the fact that this is actually a menacing threat to Ukraine. And when people are asking us, what does Ukraine mean to you? We're kind of basically saying, well, look, we don't have aspirations for owning Ukraine. We're talking about Ukraine as an independent country. We have Ukrainian Americans. From Russia's point of view, they were always sort of testing out how far were we prepared to go in terms of the defense of Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. And obviously the answer from Russia's point of view was obviously not very far. And then you have Trump basically saying to Zelensky, do me a favor, and being even willing to withhold not just a meeting at the White House, but military aid to a Ukraine that had already been attacked by Russia in 2014, and part of its territory annexed in Crimea, and a war going on in the Donbass region, which is now the big front line in this huge war. And, the Russians come away from that thinking, they don't care about Ukraine, it's just a game. It's just a total game here. And, we haven't realized how serious Putin and the people around him are. And so, as I said, that's why there is a line. And so we're still in that position now that Putin decides to invade Ukraine, fully invade Ukraine for the second time in February of 2022, because he still believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia. It's part of the Russian territory, and as Russia the successor state to the Soviet Union and essentially to the Russian Empire, it has the right to take it back, and that we won't do anything about it because really Ukraine is meaningless. And we don't mean what we say about the importance of territorial integrity, independence, sovereignty in Europe, and that we're still kind of in an old game. And, they kind of read into all kinds of things the United States has done and, kind of believe that we're not serious. And this is just, sort of a geopolitical tug of war. And so the real challenge for us right now, us writ large, the Europeans as well, and this was the discussion with the Dutch, is to really make it very clear that we meant what we said when we said no more forcible changes of borders after World War II, no more annexation of territory, no more great power war in Europe. I mean, really, this is the third great power war in Europe after World War I and World War II, with Russia playing the role of Germany now. But of course, Russia is trying to say now, I don't know if you've read this recently, but Russia has been saying that this is now the third great patriotic war for Russia. So this is, kind of Russia's last showdown with the West. coming on the heels of Napoleon, and then Nazi Germany in World War II, and that Russia's not the aggressor. Russia's not trying to take territory. Russia is fighting for its existence because it's defining this now in this context of Ukraine. So we have to find a way of articulating back why this isn't the case. And of course, we had the wars in Yugoslavia, the let's just say post-Yugoslavia wars with Kosovo and Serbia and all the atrocities there. We said we wouldn't let that happen again. But, here we are in that next great challenge of, how we deal with Ukraine. And it's very hard to say where this ends, honestly. And I'm sure that's going to be one of the questions if it was the debate today. Is there an end game in this? It's really hard to honestly to see what that might be, because getting an absolute win for Ukraine is going to be very difficult. Retaking all the territory that Russia's taken, especially as Russia's, basically said, we've annexed not just Crimea now, but Donbass, all of it. Donetsk and Luhansk, the two regions, and Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And we're not giving it up, although we might, basically negotiate in some borders. And it's also, for the rest of us, absolutely impermissible for Russia to acquire territory in this way. So there's, the kind of absolute win is very difficult. So how, and that's the big question, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to this, but that's what we're grappling towards. Do we create a set of conditions through military support for Ukraine, diplomatic efforts, economic interventions, and, basically trying to get other countries to work with us and, keep our own unity and focus on this, to create a kind of a process that may lead eventually to rolling back of Russia. I'll stop there because I can hear that other people are wanting to come in, but I'll stop there and let's take it for people's questions. But hopefully I've got the juices flowing and got people where we're heading.
Lots of questions coming in. I guess I would say we're just a couple years, 8 years, I think you said, since the Russians invaded and took. I don't know why it's called annexed. I guess it's conquered. I mean, I feel like annexed is very polite, sort of, sounds like something that happens in a boardroom.
The term of art, yes, it does sound like that. Like
Crimea.
Annexing a bit of your garden or something, moving their fences across,
The deer, right, the deer are taking. But so I just feel like, it's not that many years since the Crimean takeover, and it seems like the Russians have basically established a pattern of, we sit and we wait and we telegraph somewhat clearly. We're sitting right here on the border. We're piling up on the border. But, it's like that game the kids play. I'm not touching you. You can't get mad. I'm not touching you. You can't get mad. It just feels like they're going to wait. And we're going to get distracted. We're going to go chasing after climate change or, atrocities in Africa or whatever it is. And then they'll take their moment. And until what is the alternative to that? Because sort of permanent vigilance is a nice phrase, but it's not really sustainable in a modern capitalist culture where you're always looking forward, not back.
Yeah, look, that's the dilemma that we're facing, Dan, for sure. Of course, a lot of people also would like to see this war to end immediately, because there is a question of the human question. This is real people that we're talking about being slaughtered on a mass scale, including Russian soldiers being sent to the front, often under duress, and people being dragged from prisons and really taken from the vast regions of Russia without, kind of their consent in this. And so, there can be no satisfaction that we can feel in any way whatsoever about where we are with this war. And every single day, there's a lot of questions about the risks of escalation. Well, let's just kind of be very clear. Russia is escalating every single day. Right. So what the Ukrainians are trying to do is stop the Russians from fighting and, push back Russian forces inside of Ukraine. Right. And every single moment we hear about an attack on a kindergarten, a hospital, a block of flats, a shopping mall, that's an escalation by Russia against the civilian population of Ukraine. And every part of Ukraine is at risk. And so the Russians are going to keep on going. And, what we can see, unfortunately, is, you're saying here, even if we actually manage to successfully bring this to a conclusion, basically by a lot of the way that people are pushing, well, Ukraine's going to have to give up territory. That's another part of the debate all the time. Let's just give, kind of Russia de facto control over Donbass and Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, and in addition to Crimea, the places that Putin said that they'd taken are now part of Russia on September 30th. But why would we think it would stop there? Because when Putin invaded Ukraine, he went for the whole thing. He didn't just, kind of move against Donbass and, try to take all of it. And he's actually moved well beyond what they'd annexed, what they'd taken in Crimea. And he's actually made all of these statements to the fact that Ukraine shouldn't exist. And that's what the Ukrainians know. And other parts of the former Soviet Union or the former Russian Empire, like the Baltic states formed in the Soviet Union, which were taken back in again after getting independence by Stalin, Finland, which, got attacked by the Soviet Union in the 1940s, trying to drag them back in, and Poland and, other countries are saying this won't stop because this particular group of guys around Putin have already signaled very strongly that they intend to dominate, the region. They want the rest of us to roll back. So we're in that realm of there's no really good, satisfying response to this. And just as you said there, Diana, that what Putin thinks is that we're going to get distracted. So one of the Dutch officials actually said today, and I think this is actually a really great way of phrasing it, we have 3 battlefields that we're engaged in right now. One is the actual battlefield in Ukraine, which is for the whole future existence of Ukraine. The other is inside Russia itself, is can Putin continue to have complete control over Russia and keep sending hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths on the battlefield? I mean, if it's really 100,000 men have died so far, and Putin keeps saying, or people keep saying that Putin's willing to sacrifice 300,000, 500,000 people. Well, really? I mean, are those willing sacrifice, sacrifice, is that the right word for it? But I mean, are they willingly going there to sacrifice themselves, or does something give eventually? And then the third part is us, the Western society. And, will we get distracted? Will we, go off and fight other battles? Will we just say, okay, we give up on Ukraine? And the question is, who gives up first?
Right.
Is it Ukraine? Is it Russia that, has some kind of crisis? Or is it us? And Putin bets on it's us. People who are going to Ukraine say Ukrainians are not going to give up because they know what's at stake themselves, being. And so they're not going to give up. But Putin's banking on that the West, that we will give up.
As part of the process of making sure that we're not the ones giving up, there are all these negotiations going on. Do we bring them into NATO? Do we come up with a side agreement that's not quite NATO-esque, but has the similar parameters? Does it just involve the US? Some kind of security agreement that makes it impossible for the Russians to carry on more aggressively. Do you see a model for that somewhere? Do you see?
I think we're already doing it, actually, right? Because, I mean, I think that's another reason, of course, why Russia decided to press ahead, because they believe that Ukraine really didn't have the prospect of anyone coming to their defense. Mm-hmm. And now Putin's getting very upset to the fact that they're not just fighting with the Ukrainian army, which by now would have probably run out of ammunition, but they're now fighting with all this equipment coming in from the West. And he didn't anticipate that because, of course, Ukraine's not part of NATO. And Putin's still trying to avoid a war with NATO because of the red line of Article 5. And he hasn't made an attack on Poland. At one moment we got rather scared because it looked like a missile had gone into Poland. And then, we now know that was as a result of Ukrainians trying to shoot down a Russian missile. But Putin's being very careful and very cautious about, triggering off a full-on NATO response with attack on Poland or a Baltic country, or Romania, Bulgaria, something like this, for example. But what we're seeing, in fact, is even if Ukraine is not part of NATO, that we're all coming to the full defense of Ukraine. And so the messaging that's kind of coming out now, and I mean, I'm hearing that from Europeans and, members of NATO, but even if Ukraine is not in NATO, that we're now prepared to defend you. And if you look around the world, the United States, for example, does have a lot of bilateral defense agreements with other countries, including with some countries of Europe bilaterally, actually. We had them with Finland and Sweden. And, some of the other Scandinavian countries outside of the purview of NATO, we've got with Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, for example. And other countries have those as well. Israel, of course, has all kinds of defense agreements. And obviously, if Israel was attacked, we'd do something for Israel. I kind of imagine, that we would do for some other countries as well. And we did, of course, under different circumstances, way back in the beginning of the 90s. That's but the other intervention in Iraq to one side. We did actually, support Kuwait with a coalition after Kuwait was invaded by Iraq rather. So, I mean, that's kind of, we do have a model there. And I think, what we're debating now is about how we keep on ensuring that Ukraine really has those security guarantees. Because every other agreement that we ever had with Ukraine, going back to 1994, when we create that Budapest memorandum that's referred to, we just give them assurances. And assurances mean nothing. We said, oh, we'll help you if something bad happens. Please give up your nuclear weapons, and we'll make sure that we address any threats, and the UK and the United States and Russia also did that, but we never actually said what that would mean. And one of the Dutch interlocutors said, I wonder if we'd been much more clear, earlier on, that any other European country getting attacked, even if they were not a NATO member, that we would support them, whether, we might have been able to deter this. Because as we go back to how I started, the Russians always thought that Ukraine was just something trivial for us. It was just a game.
And I suppose it kind of depended on what else was going on that day, right?
Exactly, exactly right.
So lots of questions about different scenarios, including nuclear weapons, including becoming a member of NATO, or creating a sort of second tier category of NATO states. And then if you want to take a crack at some of the political dynamics on the Hill and how that's going to play into supporting Ukraine, and how the Hill plays into our work with Europe supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll start with that one, and then, sort of work back a bit, because, all of those are the questions about what kind of mechanisms really do depend on unified support. And if we do find, in fact, that domestic politics, yet again, interferes with that, then that does create all kinds of difficulties. And if we think back over the history of the US interventions in wars in Europe between European powers, which of course is now the third time in a century that we've had that. And Bob Kagan had a big long piece in the Sunday Washington Post, I guess it was, wasn't it? I don't know if people, saw that, talking about how, our adversaries always underestimate us in the United States because we take our time in making decisions, and we're always kind of there, and then we're pulling back, and, we're not really quite sure, sometimes what we're doing. And, World War I, we didn't want to intervene, then we ended up intervening. World War II, we didn't either, but we did support the United Kingdom. And what if we hadn't, right? If we'd pulled back, just like the debate is about Ukraine. And there was a lot of debate in Congress as to whether we should keep on supporting the United Kingdom or not. And then eventually, because of Pearl Harbor and everything else that happens, we end up in World War II. And then, we've been trying to pull back and not be the driving force in Europe. And then we found ourselves, back in that game again. Yes, I mean, if the United States continues to always be the decisive factor in European security, then what happens in Congress becomes determinative all the time. And Europeans are looking at that. And one of the discussions I was having earlier is like, we need to have more autonomy within Europe. Europe is going to have to step up as a result of what's happening here in Ukraine, sort of retrofit European security to fit that purpose. I mean, ironically, kind of getting back to that question about NATO and Ukraine and where Ukraine fits. After all of this armament, Ukraine's going to have the most effective military in Europe. It's probably going to be the largest military in Europe. So, at one point, NATO, the largest military member in terms of its forces, other than the United States, was not the United Kingdom, but Turkey. Because Turkey itself, when it joined NATO in the 1950s, was worried about being invaded by the Soviet Union after attempts on Turkey in 1949. Now, Turkey doesn't seem to care about much of this at the moment, given this back and forth with Sweden and Finland about them joining, when Finland has this giant border with Russia and is now worried about what the Russians' intent might be toward them. But, this kind of starts to, look, you think Ukraine suddenly becomes something very different. Not only have the Ukrainians proven that they're willing to fight for their independence, but they're also, now getting armed, and, they're going to be playing an important part in their own security. And the Finns were always very focused on their own security as well. They actually had a pretty competent fighting force and territorial defense and civil defense and all kinds of ways of looking at how to defend themselves, kind of against the off chance that the Russians kind of came back in again, as they did in the 1940s. Because in 1941, Finland had to fight on its own. Nobody came to help Finland in 1941 against the Soviet Union.
That's quite a mismatch.
And Finland got its independence, but it lost huge amounts of territory, of course.
It sounded like you said NATO is going to have to get itself more organized because the US takes so long and is so wishy-washy about getting in when it's time to get in.
No, I was saying more that that's kind of one of the patterns, when we're asking about
Yes.
Congress and about how we act, we always, have done this. And Bob Kagan's article lays that out. We had big debates about whether we should go into World War I. After World War I, we had debates whether we should support the League of Nations, which we'd suggested ourselves. It's been a constant pattern, and the United States had this tug between isolationism and others. And what my suggestion was that Europe needs to always factor that in, and Europeans need to get their act together.
Right. That seems to be the opinion across multiple administrations that the Europeans are.
Yeah, and I guess any kind of, it's not partisan. Everybody says, "Come on, guys,
Right.
how long?" And they themselves are saying, "Oh, here we are again." The United States had to come in with, all of this equipment and stuff because we weren't fit for purpose. Because most Europeans believed that they were living in a world of perpetual peace.
Right.
Although the Poles and the Balts and others didn't necessarily.
Right. And so back and forth with lots of questions about nuclear weapons. Do you see that as a real threat? Is that just sort of a saber rattling move?
No, I've seen it as a real threat right from the very beginning, but this is contextual, and saber rattling is obviously an important part of that because Putin always wants to play with our fears, and he's very attuned to the psychological impact of certain threats. You see the word nuclear Armageddon and people become paralyzed by fear, for example. Or he talks about the risk of a nuclear war being far greater than it has been since the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Euro Missile Crisis of the 1980s. But he's not talking about a strategic nuclear exchange or a intermediate nuclear missile exchange between the United States and Russia. He's talking about using a battlefield nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And, kind of what he's doing, he's menacing Ukraine, but he's trying to menace everyone else as well. And he's had a lot of pushback because if he did use a battlefield nuclear weapon, he's trying to cite the precedent of the United States with Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 of, basically ending a war by the detonation of nuclear weapons over Japan. Of course, we have a big debate still about, well, did that really end the war? But we also have come to the conclusion that was just such an atrocious thing to do, whether it was deemed necessary at the time or not, and the horror of it all, that we would never do this again. And although we, have had the massive proliferation of nuclear weapons since then, with China, obviously building up a major arsenal, India, Pakistan, all kinds of countries still trying to get nuclear weapons. We've got Kim Jong-un, dealing in nuclear blackmail all the time. We're worried about Iran, etc., South Africa, all kinds of other countries and, what they might be doing. We've all been of the same mind that nuclear weapons were impermissible in their use, and that the whole thing was the deterrent factor, the mutually assured destruction, we would never go there. And actually other nuclear players don't want Putin to use a nuclear weapon because then it lowers the threshold for everyone else. Because, everyone's saying, okay, there isn't really an existential threat to Russia here. If you're going to detonate a nuclear weapon on Ukrainian soil, and of course all of the literal fallout and ways from this, that might, raise the ante in future confrontations, say India, Pakistan over Kashmir, India, China. China and India have had, some hot outbreaks of conflict pretty recently, just the last few months, over disputed borders in the Himalayas. Other nuclear powers don't like that idea at all. And there's the proliferation aspect, because we told Ukraine when it gave up nuclear weapons in 1994 that we would make sure that nothing like this happened to it. And Putin's basically saying, sorry, might makes right. If you have a nuclear weapon, you can clobber everyone else and no one can do anything to you because you have a nuclear weapon. So if he could use it and he'd get an effect of getting Ukraine to surrender, like his reading of 1945, and getting everybody to say, okay, please take Ukraine because we must avoid nuclear war at all costs, then he would use one. And he's already, in a way, used nuclear weapons in the form of Chernobyl and Zaporizhia, the big nuclear plant. He's been shelling them and threatening all of us with the prospects of another Chernobyl of 1986, blowing something up, turning a nuclear plant into a weapon. So he's all over this all the time.
I thought he had Russians in those plants, making them operate and then putting the fuel back on his side.
He does now, but at the very beginning of this, if you remember, all the Russian troops went through Chernobyl, stirred up all of the radioactive dust, and then they were firing at it, and they were also firing at Zaporizhia. And he was doing this very carefully and cleverly at a particular point in time to get everyone's attention and to also frighten Europe about the use of nuclear power. Because, this is the time when he's still trying to, keep everyone dependent on oil and gas from Russia. And Germany's given up nuclear power. The Germans are freaking out. The International Atomic Energy Agency sends all of these, groups there to oversee it. And now Putin's done exactly what you said. He's now taken control of these nuclear power stations and, is trying to connect them to the Russian grid, because 55% of Ukraine's energy was generated from nuclear power. So it's a way of kind of wiping out Ukraine's nuclear capacity as well.
It's the biggest one in Europe, right? It's the biggest plant in
The
Europe.
Zaporizhia one is, yeah, something like it's like 10% of, kind of if you looked at all of the
Right.
European energy from electricity from nuclear power, 10% of it would come from Zaporizhia, if you just did it in aggregate.
Talk about the internal weakness he faces, both from domestic opinion, but also how the sanctions are playing into that, and sort of the ongoing bite as time passes.
Yeah, well, this is interesting because I don't disagree with former Secretary Gates about saying time's not on Ukraine's side, because honestly, time's not on anyone's side, right?
Right.
And it really isn't on Putin's either. For Putin, it's important to get this fixed sooner rather than later, because of the reasons of all of these sort of tensions. First of all, 1 million people have left Russia, either because they don't support the war, they're in the opposition and they don't know what to do about it, or they just don't want to die on the battlefield. And you can be sure that there are many more who got stuck and don't know what to do, family reasons, just can't imagine being anywhere other than Russia and don't want to flee, because it's a big act to flee. I mean, imagine all of us, how we would feel if we had to flee our homes. And for some people, they just can't make that leap, and they've got, too much that they don't want to leave behind. And so we already see that there is a lot of opposition. The rest of the population seems quite passive, but they don't want to be necessarily involved in the war. I mean, we're seeing these hundreds of thousands of people who are being, basically taken to the front. A lot of them are coming from prisons. I mean, again, people who don't really have a lot of choice in the matter, or they're coming from the farther reaches of Siberia and non-ethnic Russian populations. And they're being all sort of sent to the front. They're not the kids of the Moscow elites. And some of those who thought that they were going to get called up, they're the ones who left because they had the ability to leave. Then there's also, the economy, and I mean, we now know, of course, and I mean, I myself was a bit more optimistic at the initially, that when you saw so many companies pulling out, that this would have an impact. And I think what we're seeing is Russia, the economy, getting unplugged from Europe but plugging in somewhere else. So it's going to be a different economy. It's going to be adapted. It might be there's not the same voltage, different system that it's plugging into. So maybe the hairdryer doesn't work, kind of thinking about those old times when we used to travel without an adapter. But it's, plugging into the Middle East and Turkey. A lot of companies that were doing business with Russia from Europe, are now going somewhere else. But, Russia's not going to be selling its oil and gas to Europe like it was before. Will it be able to sell them in the same, amounts and for the same prices to other parts of the world? First of all, we were saying, how will Russia import stuff? Well, some stuff will just not be possible for Russia to acquire, but others might come through different ways. We might see Russia adapting in the way that Iran has done, but in a downward spiral. And over time...
Can you say more about that?
Well, if you think about what's happened in Iran was a pretty prosperous country, relatively speaking, and is not now, or Venezuela, or Zimbabwe, or somewhere that gets cut off, or South Africa. Where the economy it adapts, but it's distorted. Cuba, for example. We think about all these places, or what the Soviet Union was like before. People can say, well, it'll be like North Korea. It won't be like North Korea, because Russia has huge amounts of resources and, still a highly educated country, and it's the size of it. But you can imagine distortions and a lot less prosperity than it would have had before. I mean, think about what the United Kingdom is looking at like now, after pulling out of the European Union. And all of it's the one country that's now in a massive recession, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what Russia's done. Russia has exited Europe, and it's kind of replugging in somewhere else. And so it's going to have effects. Plus, some of the most productive members of the Russian economy are leaving. First of all, they're sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people at the front lines who are then not being computer programmers or working in startups of manufacturing companies, or in kind of consulting, you name it. And then another million have left, and they're going to be somewhere else. And look, these are mostly men and young men, in the most productive periods of their life. And Russia doesn't have a youth bulge. We're reading all the time about what's happening in China, here in the United States as well, with our own population decline. It was always kind of pushed up through migration and immigration, and not through birth rates. Well, Russia's birth rates had dropped. They actually did have a youth bulge a while back in the 2000s that helped bolster the economy. Well, that's moved on. So they've got an aging population, and he was sending out 140 million, and then suddenly you're sending out 1 million people, young men, And also there's slaughtering at the front. And a lot of people will not be having babies, kind of under this. I know I wouldn't be if I was, I mean, if you're a Russian woman, you're going to contemplate starting a family, in the middle of all of this. Now, of course, Ukraine is getting absolutely and utterly ravaged, and the demographic impact, from Ukraine will be considerable. But if you look back to Russia's previous history, in 1900, Russia was the fastest growing population in Europe. By 1945, it was one in massive decline, and that was the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union because of the mass death, in two sets of world wars and revolution and civil war. And this is just Russia itself. It's not the Soviet Union. It was already a population that was, kind of maybe slightly growing at different points, but, otherwise declining. And it's not, that it declines in absolute numbers. It's the kind of the quality of your human capital.
Right.
And Russia's hollowing itself out and also stifling innovation, this political control. You're not going to get a country that's kind of adapting to, and meeting the challenges of the modern time by the way it's being run at the moment.
Where do you see China fitting into this? Is it possible that China will at some point make the calculation that it's to its own advantage? Presumably that's the motivator for all of us, to come around and actually join more on the European US side of applying sanctions and starting to exclude Russia from commercial or other activity?
Well, I think is what we have to drive towards that, because I'm basically of the same mind that that's one of the few means of, really trying to kind of bring this war to some kind of conclusion, to basically constrain Russia's ability to do what it's doing. We haven't seen a lot of evidence of China really helping Russia's sanctions bust, and we know that the Chinese are unhappy about the nuclear saber rattling and the prospect that Russia was actually going to use a nuclear weapon, which I think there's a point where they might have been seriously contemplating it, and the Chinese and Indians and others, this is around the time of the G20 in Bali in Indonesia, basically said, because I remember I can look back in my phone when I was sending desperate tweets and not tweets, messages to, various colleagues saying, "Whoa, I think something's happening," because everything, that I was sort of seeing up there led to, kind of great deal of concern. But then you could see this diplomatic response. So we know that China can actually dissuade Russia from doing things. I mean, we don't know if they can, though, make that leap to be more proactive in trying to kind of push back here, because it's not really in China's interest to see Russia fail or for Putin to look like he's defeated, because President Xi of China has made a kind of commitment to Putin. They talked about a limitless partnership. They were seeing each other all the time. And there's that tension with the United States. And, now we see Tony Blinken's not going to go to China because the weather balloon or the surveillance balloon. And I mean, presumably, hopefully he'll go back there again. But our relationship with China, all of the downs, rather than the ups, are something that keep kind of propelling China and Russia together as well. And so
they don't seem like very they don't seem like very enthusiastic partners. And I suspect much of why China and Russia are together has more to do with them not wanting to be with us than them wanting to be in partnership necessarily.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, also there is some other strategic elements that if we didn't exist, the size of the Chinese market, proximity. I mean, they have a huge border. The Russians actually, have a real vested interest in China being nice to them, because they actually sit on vast swathes of territory that was once China's. As Putin goes down this path of saying that all borders can be changed and Russia has, kind of a right to this territory, after the 1860s, Russia had taken a whole swathe of imperial Chinese territory because it was, kind of the Chinese were weak. And so all that territory east of Lake Baikal, north of the Amur River, going out to sort of Vladivostok, that was once part of China. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of territory that was once China. And of course, Germany relinquished territory after World War II. Kaliningrad, the exclave of Russia on the Baltic Sea, was old Königsberg. That's never been part of, Russia before. Russia in its sort of imperial extension took all kinds of, territory at different points. So what's to stop China later down the line, a long way down the line, possibly, and I don't know whether they'll ever actually do it, but making claims to that territory again. So I think Russia really does have to tread somewhat carefully with China. Again, they have a strategic imperative themselves to have a good relationship because of, some of these other historic issues. There's also the drive of the Chinese economy. And now if Russia is unplugging from Europe, they'll want to, plug in perhaps even more to China, but that is going to, increased dependencies. But for China, those dependencies are useful. Certainly having Russia in their camp against the United States, or just generally, I mean, Russia's also an Asia Pacific power, is quite useful. China's also trying to see if they can pull Europe away from the United States. I mean, unfortunately, China and Russia still see everything as a battle with the United States for spheres of influence or access to markets, and are still in a kind of 19th and earlier 20th century mode, which is kind of a part of a problem. But look, we feed into that too, the way we talk about it. It's almost as if, it's like the whole Gary Cooper high noon, kind of, this place isn't really sort of, big enough for the two of us kind of thing, or the three of us.
The three of us. Multiple questions about health. Alexei Navalny's health, Putin's health. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Alexei Navalny's health can't be good. I mean, look at the way he's being treated in prison, and his doctors and lawyers, keep making appeals. And obviously, I mean, the guy miraculously survived being poisoned with Novichok, but that's got to have had some knock-on effects. I mean, I think the Russians are trying to slowly kill him. No, they want him to die. And in fact, actually, this is what's happening to Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia. We forget about Saakashvili, and the Russians must be rubbing their hands with glee. Mikhail Saakashvili is clearly very sick at the moment, and he's sitting in a Georgian jail because of accusations of abuses of power. And this is kind of really where the Russians would like to see a Zelensky or anybody who's crossed them in the past being turned on by their own population. And today the Ukrainians made an appeal, to the Georgians, like, whoa, what are you doing here? Kind of let Saakashvili go, because it's the kind of thing that Putin does, kind of, trying to punish people and torture them and, lead them towards a, kind of a slow death. And as for Putin himself, well, he, like all of us, is marching towards death at some point. And, we don't know, whether he's sick or not. I hear, I was in Norway a couple of weeks ago, and senior people kept saying, well, we're hearing that he's got thyroid cancer. Well, he could have, and that's managed and manageable. We know, for example, that JFK had Addison's disease, right? And we know that President Erdogan of Turkey has had colon cancer, and all kinds of people have had all kinds of health issues. But we can't indulge in sort of wishful thinking that Vladimir Putin's on his way out, because in one thing that might make him even more desperate to resolve things before he's gone. And then the other side of things as well, sometimes I wonder if a lot of this rumors is deliberately spread, because it throws people off guard. It gets them distracted. What you were saying earlier about then we move on to something else. People are just spending the whole time, just instead of preparing for the eventuality they might be with us forever, not for a very long time, because you can't be there forever, but on out for next year, as we keep just waiting and hoping for him to go away and don't do anything. There gets a certain amount of passivity there. And it's also...
Wait, that sounds like this country. Sorry.
Yes, I know. I mean, we're always on, if you're on a death watch, you're not actually taking action, are you? It's a kind of dissuading from action. And it's also sometimes to flush people out and see how they respond. So there's a lot of worry right now. Again, I was about Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former, catering chef, the head of the Wagner Group, and lots of articles in the press about, will he be the next Mr. Putin? And we're meant to think, oh my God, look at him. He's had people killed with sledgehammers, and, he's absolutely awful. Can we imagine him, kind of taking over from Putin? Well, Putin's pretty bad all of himself. I mean, he's had people poisoned with Novichok and polonium, and had people taken out, and Prigozhin works for him, so that sledgehammer, comes under Putin's auspices as well. And I think, we're meant to think, oh my God, we're so lucky to have Vladimir Putin. Look, who else could be here? So the thing is, I mean, this is all a big game. We have to kind of ask ourselves why we, being fed this speculation. But the bottom line is, what a situation to have where everything depends on one man and whether he's sick or not. I mean, that ought to be a really cautionary tale, that we ourselves in this country should never be in a situation where everything hinges on one person.
Right.
And any other country as well. I mean, basically, Vladimir Putin's the ultimate wild card. I was going to say Trump card, but I changed my mind.
Yeah, none of us call him an ace either.
Really.
So
he's the queen of spades, maybe, right? Yeah,
the Joker.
Yeah.
So there's so many pieces. There's the rest of Europe, there's China, there's India, there's Russia itself, there's the will of the people in Ukraine. Are there determining factors here that you think are going to be game changers in terms of how soon do the tanks get there from Germany and the US, or do we decide to give them fighter planes, or short of Putin dying or something sort of similarly.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're often game changers, and they're not something that we foresee, right? Sometimes it's a natural disaster, and I just said that because of a sudden gust of wind and something blew against my window there. I was like, "Whoa! I could be taken out by a plant pot coming through right now. That'll be the end of me." While you're all watching, I mean, there's some things. Sometimes just things happen that nobody's ever anticipating, right? I mean, Stalin had a hemorrhage and dropped to the floor, and then we've all seen the death of Stalin. Everyone's running around not knowing what to do. There are all kinds of things that can happen and can go wrong. All right, depending on one's perspective here. But there are lots of factors at play, and a lot of it, and this is the terrible answer. People are like, "Oh God, here we go again." It all depends. Depends on the context. It depends on how all of these factors interact with each other. We're always talking about the butterfly effect. There are things that we haven't that could be already in motion. That we haven't even thought about. The whole is it Poor Richard's rhyme about all for the want of a horseshoe nail. There could be something. It won't be a tank, but it might be, something else that's deficient on the battlefield, or it might be tensions that are building up in the political system, kind of a whole host of people who don't want to be at the front and run away and do various things. We're starting to see a lot of defections. In World War I, lots of the Russian soldiers left the battlefield and just said, "I'm sick of this. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm off." And that was one of the precipitating factors for the Russian Revolution. The first part of it, and then you have Vladimir Lenin, kind of coming along, kind of later, and that whole trajectory switches off. A lot of it depends on how we keep our act together. I said that that Dutch diplomat had talked about the 3 battlefields, Ukraine, and what's actually happening literally in the battle, and how the Ukrainian people can live up to it, Russia itself, and all these tensions that are obviously there. And then, how we perform, kind of, do we have leadership? And I think, part of the problem here is, again, it can't all be the United States, because, Russia is trying to portray this as the kind of the collective West. One person pointed out to me that the Chinese often refer to Europe as American countries. In other words, the countries that are directed by America and have no independence. So if the European kind of get their own leadership and kind of not just have Boris Johnson running around or Emmanuel Macron, to actually kind of be more forceful. And there's a lot of European leaders who want to do that. They're more on the periphery in Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Poland, the Baltic states. But they're trying to take the initiative and are here, and that might get a groundswell. I mean, I have been very struck by the certainty among most Europeans I've talked to at the public level, but also, at the elite level, but also somewhat at the public level, that they're doing this for the right reasons, that they have to protect Ukraine because the future of Europe is at stake because of what had happened in World War I and World War II. And they can't let a country come in again and do what was, done on so many other occasions. And they're grateful for US leadership, and they're kind of recognizing that, whoa, yet again, we needed the US to help here, but that we now need to do something. And that, I think, is also part of the whole question. If Europe can get its act together, because, they hoped it would all go away. And there's still a lot of people, talking about, well, if we just say that Ukraine can't be part of NATO, we agree to give the Russians Crimea and Donbass, and, then negotiate over Kherson and Zaporizhia. There was a peace treaty on the table before, surely we can do that. Well, look, the world has moved on in any case. And that's really not likely to resolve this, because Ukrainians now hate Russians. They hate Russians. Who in Ukraine is going to, want to engage with Russia again for a generation or more? It took generations for all of us to, reconnect with Germany. And that was under Germany under, it was divided and under occupation. So, all of this will really depend on how we keep the perspective and keep things together.
So I guess a final question. We're out of time here.
Talk on too much. Sorry.
What 2 or 3 things do you see that we're really getting right? We, the US, or we, the US and the Allies? Where are the points of hope for you?
Well, I think we are getting it right in sort of like understanding what this is, that this is, kind of basically a war of aggression. There are a lot of people out there saying, oh, we did this, it's our fault, we provoked Russia. But I think an awful lot of people are, basically openly saying, no, look, the Russians provoked themselves. And, maybe we got it wrong by not understanding, kind of how much they were still seeing things in the terms of, the Russian Empire or the old Soviet Union. But we've got it right that this is an invasion, act of aggression, and that we need to roll it back. So the fact that we understand that we have to give Ukraine the support to defend itself. I do think it's right not to take that war into Russia itself, to be frank. And I think that that's where the administration, people are getting frustrated with being cautious and not having a doctrine and not having an end game. But that's also because it's not the United States war, even, and it's kind of we're not in as we were in World War II. We haven't had kind of the same mechanism coming, but we are absolutely trying to get Ukraine and Europe to defend themselves. I think other things that we're trying to get right, is although we do have right, is the need for unity and our own dealing with our own resilience. Whether we can actually get it right, we have it right, that's what we need to do, but whether we can get it right is another question. But I do have hope that we can, because that's why I'm speaking out and why so many others are as well. And I think that we have to keep having these kinds of debates here. And then the other thing is that I think we've understood that correctly, that there are global dimensions to this, that we've as often is the case, a war has a knock-on effect, and that we're going to have to rethink how we've been postured economically, politically, and in terms of our diplomacy internationally as well. We've seen the impacts that this has had on food security, for example, not just inflation here in the United States, but that we're going to have to rethink in the future about international food security. After World War II, we started thinking about coal and steel communities. We're going to have to think, I think, now about agriculture, agribusiness, food, grain, fertilizers, as well as energy in a very different way. Especially as what this has done is really set back our ability to grapple with climate change. This has been an enormous and horrific distraction and has exactly exacerbated that problem. So I think what we get right now is the realization that we're going to have to do things differently. And then the question has to be about what are the elements of that and how do we actually do it?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for joining us again. I hope that we don't have to wait until 2 years every time, but congratulations again on the book. There's nothing for you here. I see it conveniently placed over your shoulder as well. And we look forward to following your career path as you continue to shake up the world and get people straightened out on making progress. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And please, everybody, stay warm in the cold spell. It's like that was a bit of a big windy gust there, so I hope you don't get blown away.
Great. Thank you so much.
Really great
We're
to
just
see
going to
everyone.
close up. We're going
Thanks so much.
to close up with just a quick reminder for our 2 upcoming events. On February 18th is our virtual Annapolis Day with our state legislators. Montgomery County has the biggest state delegation. And then on February 21st, a conversation with Jason Green, who is a local documentary filmmaker, moderated by our own Fatmata Berry, who's our new board member. So thank you, everyone. The chat has the link for the 2 events I just mentioned. It's also on our WDC website, and I look forward to seeing you on the 18th. Everyone stay warm and stay engaged. Thanks.
Well done.
Fox does. Oh yeah, she always does. Yeah, I thought they were gonna stay on and chat.